WTF happened to Amanda Bynes?
As a child she was repeatedly raped by Schneider.
Bring out the dancing lobsters.
Court dismissed! Bring in the dancing lobsters!
Just ask Dan Whole Hand Insider Schneider.
That nigga is stroking underwater.
Beer can Dan, Danny Diapers, Ass Man Dan, Danny Daycare, Spread 'em Dan, Candy Man Dan, Family Man Dan, Big Daddy Dan, Deep Throat Dan, The Big Dick at Nick, Dirty, Dan Schneider, Open Wider Schneider, Schneider the Butcher, Dan Bend Over, Schneider, Dan Foot Soldier, Schneider, Dan, The Man, Schneider, Dan, The Biter, Schneider, Dan, The Spider, Schneider, Dan, The Defiler, Schneider, Dan, The Initiator, Schneider, Down South Dan Schneider, Dan, The Plunger, Schneider,
Dan, show me your feet so I can skate, Schneider.
Dan, The Bladder, Schneider, Dan, The Seducer, Schneider, Dan Teen Better, Schneider, Dan Rough Rider, Schneider, Dan, The Collector, Schneider, Dan No Lube Required, Schneider, Dan, The Despoiler, Schneider. Dan Deep Pounder, Schneider, Dan She's a Fighter, Schneider, Dan Get in the Van, Schneider, Dan Cunny Hoarder, Schneider. Dan, I've had tighter, Schneider, Dan, the fart inhaler, Schneider, Dan, deep inside her, Schneider, Dan, the overnighter, Schneider, Dan came inside her, Schneider, Dan, please mister, slower, Schneider, Dan, likes him tighter, Schneider, Dan, the rough rider, Schneider, Dan, the meat grinder, Schneider, Dan, the diaper slider, Schneider, Dan, the cheek divider, Schneider, Dan, the hymen divider, Schneider, Dan, the hymen collider, Schneider, Dan, the demolition man, Schneider, Dan, the cervix wrecker, Schneider, Dan, this one's a bleeder, Schneider, Dan, the pussy annihilator, Schneider, Dan, the starlet sodomizer, Schneider, Dan, the man with the plan to get the girl in the van, Schneider.